And thank you all for joining me this evening. First of all, I noticed that your logo is the belted kingfisher, which made me very happy because, as you know, probably that this is the female belted kingfisher, and she's the one that has the rusty belt across her belly, whereas the male only has the blue and white coloration. It's one of the less common cases in a North American bird where the female is more colorful. So I'm thrilled that you guys chose such an apt logo. So thanks for being with me today. My presentation is just geared at teaching folks how to appreciate female birds and why we should appreciate female birds. And I will be asking some questions to people as we go. So feel free to type those answers in the chat and be a little bit interactive here. First of all, I want to give a quick shout out to my fellow Galbatrosses, and I'll talk more about them later, as well as people from the Female Birdsong Project that preceded us and definitely inspired me and the other Galbatrosses, as well as the birder Ken Kaufman and many others that have spoke eloquently about female birds before. Thanks to Izzy and the Audubon chapter of Minneapolis for having me tonight. So a quick outline of what I'm going to be talking about. First, well, why focus on female birds specifically? I'm going to give you some reasons and just explain that a little more. I talk about Female Bird Day and the Galbatross Project. And I'm going to talk about identification tips for female birds in the visual, vocalization, and behavior aspects. I'm 100% positive that many of you are better birders than I am. And I look forward to learning things from you guys. If there's tips and tricks that you know, please do share them in the chat as well. But I'm hoping that you'll be able to learn a thing or two, either about the ecology or the science of female birds, even if you're a really great birder, that maybe there's some things that you maybe haven't considered before. It is very hard to look for and identify female birds. So in some cases, it's not possible, as you probably know as well. And then finally, I'm going to talk about female bird song and some of the research that I'm doing for my PhD. So first, why female birds? Why do we need to make a fuss specifically about females? Well, I Googled just birds, and these are some of the first images that came up with the Google search. This beautiful male Baltimore Oriole, a stunning blue jay, and a lovely scarlet tanager. The thing that these birds all have in common is that they're bright and they're visually attractive, and humans are visual creatures. We have really well developed cones and we're drawn to colors. And in North America, a lot of these colorful birds happen to be males. I have a quick quiz for people to start this off. Does anybody know the ID of this bird here? If you do, let's see. Yeah, if you can type it in. I'm not sure if it's better to go in the chat or Q&A, but go ahead and type in if you know the species of this bird here. And give people a few seconds. This is tricky, so don't feel bad if you don't know it. I certainly didn't. Okay, this bird is the scarlet tanager. Just like that bright red individual we saw, it's the same species, except she's a female and she looks just like a lot of other tanager species. Well, and you know, we have this sort of ingrained tendency in us to be drawn to the more colorful birds, and that might cause us to unintentionally sort of overlook these duller birds, many of which tend to be females. Now I'm going to be talking about these terms a lot, so I want to just define this for anybody who might not be familiar with them. One is dimorphic. Di means two and morph means types, so that means that there's two different looks or types in one species. Down here is my personal favorite bird, the California quail. On the left is the male and on the right is the female. She has less of a plume and a little bit of a different coloration on her face, less striking facial markings. And then the top is a really amazing example of dimorphism in this species called the Ecology's parrot. Zookeepers were sort of confused for a long time because they were keeping the red birds with the red birds and the green birds with the green birds, and these birds were not breeding with each other. But it turns out that the red birds are female, and they, in their natural habitat, defend territories and have multiple mates on that territory. And the green ones are the males, who also mate with multiple females, but they're more camouflaged and they go about collecting food and providing for their partners. So it wasn't and then the zookeepers started to keeping the red parrots with the green parrots, and they realized that they're of the same species. So that's a really striking example of dimorphism. We can contrast this with something called the bird like the black crowned night heron, where in the adult form, both male and female look like this. So this species is monomorphic. It only has one form. All right. So I talked about some birds that are striking and very clearly dimorphic. In the top row, we have 3 birds where the males are brighter than the females. But in the bottom row, we have birds where the males and females are just as colorful as each other. And this happens more in the neotropics. So I do want to point out that because we live in North America, we might be more used to males being more colorful than females, but that's certainly not the case, particularly in the tropics, where oftentimes both male and female are defending a territory. So both of them look similar and sing to each other and are actively defending the territory. So that's why they may look monomorphic. And then, of course, we have examples like our North American phalaropes, where the female is the more colorful one in the breeding plumage. So we have the redneck phalarope on the left and red phalarope on the right. And in these cases, the birds are polyandrous, meaning that the female has multiple mates. She's more colorful, she's more aggressive, she defends the territory, and the males take the bulk of the chick rearing responsibilities. I hope that some of you have seen these in their breeding plumage. That's one of my life goals. It would be lovely to see these striking birds not in their non-breeding plumage. And then this sort of bias toward the more colorful of sex or more goes toward is definitely present in photography and art as well. How many times have we seen a red northern cardinal, and how often do they portray the female version of that, which is much less pleasant to look at to our human eyes? This, of course, is present in naming, this bias toward males. We have the blue grosbeak on the left. There's nothing blue about this female. She's completely brown, and the name is only made for the male of this species. And the red-winged blackbird is one that's familiar to a lot of us. Of course, the males are clearly have the red epaulets, but females are brown and streaked. This bird also confuses me quite a lot every spring when it's sort of almost easy to mistake them for a sparrow, except for their beaks. But anyway, the naming of these birds are clearly male biased. I want to read this short little passage, just describing it in a lighthearted way. Like other ladies, the little feathered brides have to bear their husbands' names, however inappropriate. What injustice! Here an innocent creature with an olive green back and yellowish breast has to go about her days known as the black-throated blue warbler, just because that happens to describe the dress of her spouse. All right, so a little example showing that in names, we don't even think twice, but they're not necessarily named for all the species. Maybe only 30% of the species of the males that are in the breeding plumage, when you take into account there's juveniles who haven't gotten that plumage yet. This bias is certainly prevalent in bird watching, such that in this article, which I'll share with you all later in the chat, Ken Kaufman writes that he knows a birder who once would not list a female of that species on their list until on his life list. So he had to see the male. But how does that make any sense if you think about it when you're only counting 50% of the members of that species, and you won't even count it if you see one that is not a male? So there's certainly a bias in how we think about birds, and that's not always good for the birds. And why does this bias matter? Well, in conservation, which pertains to preserving parts of land and habitat that birds need, males and females don't always use the same habitat, particularly when they're not breeding. So I'm going to give an example of some neotropical migrants. So this golden wing warbler breeds here in North America, but it spends its winters in Honduras and other parts of Central America. But essentially, what happens is that the males are slightly larger, they're more dominant, and they exclude females from the higher quality primary forest habitat. And so females are found more in the secondary habitats with more with lower canopy heights and more sparse coverage and more secondary growth forest, whereas males are found in like intact primary forest. And the places where female golden wing warblers are found in the non-breeding season tend to be at lower elevations, and those are closer to human inhabitations. And this article by Dr. Bennett found that the habitats that females were in were logged at a much higher rate than the habitats where male golden wing warblers were found. It's not super clear what sort of fitness and survival consequences that might have on the birds, but it's definitely worthwhile to at least consider that males and females may be using different habitats, and therefore it wouldn't be complete if you only conserve half of the habitats that are required, for example. And this pattern of habitat segregation has been found in 2/3 of migratory land birds in the non-breeding season. Some other warblers that exhibit this behavior include American redstart, hooded warbler, common yellowthroat, magnolia warbler, northern parula. These are all species where males and females don't use the exact same habitats. Besides using different spaces geographically, a study found that there's vertical habitat segregation. So whether these black and white warblers are in a mangrove or scrub habitat in the non-breeding season, the females are found to use the understory a lot more than males. So this proportion is higher for the understory for females, whereas males tend to use the canopy and mid canopy. So females using kind of lower habitats and males using higher habitats. And they think this is also due to dominance. Another interesting conservation application I found is that in the wandering albatross, breeding females had a higher risk of being caught in long-line tuna operations because there was greater overlap with fishing fleets. What was happening is that in the southern Atlantic Ocean, females tend to be closer to the equator where more fishing operations occur, and males, which have higher wing loading, were flying farther south toward the Antarctic areas, and they sort of intersected a little less with these fishing operations. So you can have sex-specific impacts of human activity on birds when males and females use different habitats. I will say that this pattern is not prevalent across all regions. This other study by Dr. Collett did not find that males and females use different habitats, and did not find there's a difference in fishing operation impacts on the sexes. But this was done in the Indian Ocean, so it might just be regional specific. In another sort of really direct example, climate change has occasionally flooded nests of burrow nesting species, such as this wedge-tailed shearwater. And this species tends to have females that nest in it, that incubate the nest, in some cases causing direct mortality when there's flooding events. Sort of a less direct impact of climate change is the timing of migration. So if on the x-axis we have the time of year, with later in the year going this way, and the frequency of when birds are arriving in the spring, typically males arrive earlier than females from the tropics, such as this yellow warbler, which winters in the neotropics and breeds here in North America. But with climate change, that's expected to shift so that the birds have been found to arrive earlier in the spring. But does that shift line up for males and females? My lab mate Monty Meekleg has found that males are indeed advancing their migration phenology, so they're migrating earlier, but females have not advanced their phenology as quickly. And so what does this mismatch in when they're arriving mean? This is a question that remains yet to be seen. Yeah, I talked a lot about why it matters that we should pay attention to female birds, because they don't do the same things as males. They sometimes use different places. They have different migration patterns. They are sometimes subordinate to males. But at the same time, there's a scientific bias in how data is collected on males and females. If there is a difference between the sexes, you would want to study both of them and be able to tell the patterns from both males and females apart from each other. But a lot of the time, sex information is not collected when we do scientific studies. So, eBird is a tool that I'm sure many of you use that's incredibly powerful, and a lot of us use it for research in our own big data analyses. And it's got this breeding code field where you can enter in very specific things, such as a singing male was present for 7 or more days, or there's physiological evidence of nesting. But you can't currently on the mobile app enter in the basic information of whether a bird is a male or female. That's one of the most salient biological traits, yet it's currently not available on the mobile app anyway to collect this data. It's something that I've emailed and talked with folks at eBird and Cornell multiple times, and they're aware of this gap, and they said that they will look into it. But as far as I know, there's currently no option to enter in sex or age information on the mobile app. You can enter it in on desktop. So if you do use eBird on your computer and you have data, please do enter it in. It definitely helps, because I can't currently use eBird to do my data analysis because there's not enough sex information. But the more that people like you enter it in, we would be able to amass a bigger collection of data. This study by Natalie Cooper found that museum collections are biased toward males, possibly because they're flashier and larger and so forth. And then there's also a lot of survey methods that are biased toward males, such as detecting males that are singing. During the breeding season, oftentimes females tend to sing less than males, although I'll show you later that that's not always true. So if we assume that there's an equal number of females but that's not necessarily true, because sometimes males will sing in the absence of a female. So it's a little bit biased just in the way that we collect data about birds. So that brings me to the Galbatross Project. We were noticing these biases in how people birdwatch and these biases in how data is collected. And the 5 of us began this project called the Galbatross Project. We're a group of scientists, birders, and conservationists that first met through the National Audubon Society. In 2019, my colleagues Martha, Perbita, and Stephanie, pictured here, went to do the World Series of Birding in New Jersey. And they powerfully only counted if they had seen a female bird. So kind of exactly the opposite of what that one birder did of only counting males. They only counted definitive females, and these three are some of the best birders I know who just are stunning across the US. But they, after a whole day, they only came up with a count of 30 species. I think they only beat out a group of toddlers that were also competing that day, which is just a testament to how hard birding for female birds is. But there we go. That's how the Galbatross Project was established, was with this female bird day through the World Series of Birding. What do? We have to do educational talks like this one. We do outreach and awareness mostly on social media. And the Galbatrosses also, we sort of promote this female bird day weekend every Memorial Day weekend. So apologies, these were the dates from last year, but this Memorial Day will encourage folks to go out there and look for female birds and share ID tips that they have come across. Yeah, so speaking of which, how can you be more aware of female birds? One of our goals is to encourage people to look for these tips that are really subtle, but they're certainly doable once you learn what to look for. One of the ways that bird males and females can be dimorphic is visibly dimorphic. We all know about the northern flicker, but if you look closely, the male northern flicker has a moustachial patch under his eye, whereas the female does not. So if you see one next time with a black spot, that's a male, and the one that has a clear face would be a female. This is a very easy example of dimorphism, male and female house finch, except that the individual on the right could be an immature house finch, particularly in the late summer and fall after the juveniles have hatched and are hatchier birds of that year. So during the fall, things can get messy and the males can look like females. We talked about this a little bit, but here's an example of a male of a female on the left and male belted kingfisher. I love this bird in particular because it's one of the rare cases where the belt is named for the red belt of the female. So it's named for a female trait rather than a male characteristic. Here are some more subtle examples of sexual dimorphism. The bill of the European starling can indicate what sex it is. Females have a slight pink tinge at the base of their bill, whereas males have gray at the base of their bill. So right at the gap, there's some gray coloration, there's some pink here. For me, this is a difficult trait in the field because oftentimes they're far perched on a wire and I can't always see the gape, but just a really subtle, fun one for y'all to pay attention to next time. There can be dimorphism in size. So this is the American kestrel, where the male is this bird on the right and the female is perched on the left. So in raptors, females are larger, and even though the male is in the foreground compared to the female, you can still see that the female is larger than the male. So that shows that female kestrels are bigger. Female kestrels are also more dominant. So in areas where the female has been removed, there's been cases of males moving into her territory because otherwise the larger, more dominant bird would have excluded the males from her territory. So here is one of our quizzes here. Does anyone know what species this bird is? This hawk, I'll give it to you that it's a hawk. What species of hawk is this? Looking at things like the tail and the eye and the shape. I'll give it a minute. But while while folks think about this, I'll mention that the female is larger than the male. Again, going with raptors, that's the pattern here. What's fun is that this is a first year female. She's got the brown back and she's molting into her adult feathers, which is really fun. Female Cooper's hawk. I gave it away, but somebody got it right in the chat and in the Q&A. Yeah, Cooper's is exactly it. They have yellow eyes in their first year, and the eye color gets to a orangey and finally a red as they grow older. So the eye color is a trait of age, whereas the size is a trait of sex. Here we have the great horned owl. I don't know why, but this is a really striking case, and normally I don't think I've seen the sizes be that dimorphic in the field, but again, the female is larger than the male. And I'm going to play you a call, but there's a pair duetting here, and the female is actually higher pitched than the male. So listen for that. Yeah, so one of the birds starts calling. I believe the female starts. Yeah, that's right. And then the male is in the background here, a little bit lower pitched, which always kind of trips me up because the female is bigger. You would think she's lower pitched, but it's actually the male that's lower pitched. This is a really arcane fact about female birds, but in swallows, only the females will perform nest sanitation. Folks might have heard about this where baby birds produce these fecal sacs, think of them as like diapers, and parents have to take them out of the nest and dispose of them just to clean it up. But only female swallows engage in nest sanitation. I'm not sure about all the other species, but if you see a swallow doing this, it's a female. And then there's some nesting behaviors that only females do. In kingbirds and chickadees, and only the females build the nest and incubate the nest. Other birds in which only the females incubate include Canada goose, American robin, song sparrow, and all Empidonax flycatchers, whether you can ID it or not. If you see one sitting on a nest, then it is a female. Let's see. Oops. And then we often think that it's the mom that cares for the young, but I'd like to suggest that that's a sort of a human social norm that we're imposing on the birds, and that across the global phylogeny of birds, across the global diversity of birds, it's not necessarily the case that only females do, and that in fact chick rearing roles are actually quite balanced, especially toward the tropics, which we're less familiar with. But this is a case where in the common merganser, only the females care for the chicks. I think in this photo, what happened is a bunch of different chicks from different broods just hopped on this train and started following this female. It's not all her chicks. It's just, it does make for an incredible picture. But at the end of the day, I've given you some tips and hopefully you've learned something, but it's not always possible to tell males and females apart. In a mourning dove, they say that the eye coloration, the blue is a little more blue in the male, but in this pair, I really can't tell which one is the male and which one's the female. This is a quiz on the species of the female bird on the right. Does anyone know what species this is? So let's see, here we have this really incredible side-by-side view of a downy on the left and a larger hairy woodpecker. These two are both males. They have the red spot on their head. The female does not, so that's another trait to look out for. But yeah, anybody know the species of this bird on the right? Okay, I see something in the Q&A. Yeah, it's a hairy. That's right. You got it. So she has a like a more a longer bill in relation to its to her face. But yeah, female hairy woodpecker there. Um, in a really fun bird, the eastern towhee, the male is brighter, has that like striking black plumage, and the female has more of a brown plumage. So this is another example of a subtle sexual dimorphism. I've mentioned the mustachio stripe on the northern flicker, but that this red also is the case in the pileated woodpecker, where the male has that red cheek patch. And this really subtle trait is that in the red of the male's crest meets his bill, but in the female pileated woodpecker, the red is separated by a black part and then before it reaches the bill. This is also, we're getting into the really subtle territory where the male cedar waxwing has a blacker throat patch than the female. So if you see a group of them together, you might be able to tell how dark their throats are relative to each other. This is one of my favorite facts, and this is true in black and American oystercatcher species, where the male has a clear round pupil and the female often has a fleck sort of sticking out of the pupil. Scientists aren't really sure why this is, but it's found in something like 98% of the birds with a flex or DNA to be female. So this is a weird dimorphic trait that's incredibly out there. Okay, here is another one, and I would love to see this bird too, but you guys probably have it near Minneapolis. But yeah, the piping plover is actually dimorphic as well. The bird on the left is a female, and the bird on the right is a male. Um, the female has more black on the bill. The black extends further up, whereas the male has a little bit less black on his bill, and the orange on his mandible is a little more bright in the piping plover. And sometimes you've got, I think one of these birds is male, one's a female, but I don't remember which because they look identical. If you see this bird in like fall, one of these birds could have just been hatched that summer and has not developed into his alternate or breeding plumage yet. So the time of year has a lot to do with whether you can identify a bird positively to male or female. This is the yellow warbler, if I failed to mention that. And then you've got birds like the American coot, where the sexes are identical and they often hang out in pairs or bigger groups, so can't tell just by looking at them. This is one of my favorite examples of a bird that's vocally dimorphic. So we heard from the great horned owl, but right from California, we have the wren-tit. So we have the female that kind of whose call ping pongs a little bit. It goes pip 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 pip. And then I just started playing the male call, where he starts out with the same pits, but it accelerates toward the end into a trill. I don't know how familiar people are with the wren-tit, but you can almost never see them. But just by walking around the chaparral here, I can. It's crazy to be able to tell the sexes apart just by their songs because they're always singing in defending territories. So it's really wild to just be able to tell sexes apart just from whether they accelerate at the end of their trill or they don't. I want to talk, this lends me into the Female Birdsong Project. I want to talk about this for a little bit, where traditionally we thought, oh, only male birds sing. And that's a construct that came from North America and Europe, where it is true that many of the birds that sing are males, but these researchers, particularly Doctors Odom, Riebel, Dr. Webster, and Benedict, have found that at least 150 North American species have female song. So essentially, of passerine species, there's a lot that we don't even know if there's sex specific song information. But of the quarter or so that we have sex specific song information for, they found that in 2/3 of them have female bird song, whereas the other 1/3 don't have female bird song. So they're arguing that it's time to change the narrative that only male birds sing and female birds are attracted to his territory and come in and mate, because that's not the case. In fact, they go on to study that across the different types of birds, bird diversity across the world, that in the majority of them do have female bird song as an ancestral trait, and that trait has subsequently been lost in some lineages. We could get into the reasons of why female birds sing, but it's a lot of the same reasons as male birds do, is to communicate, to defend territories, and to and for social selection as well as sexual selection purposes. I'm nearing the end of my talk, but yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about something else that the Galbatross Project has been involved in. Essentially, when I was working at Audubon, I was looking for images of female birds, and I searched our Audubon database, and I said, I talked to the director of the photography, and I was like, I had a hard time finding images of female birds. A lot of them are the photos just show the male and not the female. And she said, you know what, you're right. We should change that. And so in 2021, to her credit, she started this Female Bird Prize Award for the Audubon Photography Awards, where we are encouraging photographers to go out and take photos of and submit photos of female birds, and that greatly encouraged folks to go out and photograph female birds, and just to raise awareness that, hey, just because they're less colorful and less flashy maybe doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to the females. And so it's been my great pleasure to be a part of the Female Bird Prize judging team for the last couple of years. In 2021, we awarded the Female Bird Prize to Elizabeth Yichen Shen, who photographed this female northern harrier. The males are gray colored and females are brown, and we just thought the lighting and how intensely she was focused on probably a mouse or something in the marsh was just such a stunning shot. In 2022, the winner was Ellen Crocker with this greater sage grouse. This again is a species that we know so much about the male liking system and his beautiful and weird like air sacs that puff up during the mating season, but it's all really for the females, and you can't have a successful lek without females. So it's nice to have a picture that focuses on the female who's sort of shyly poking out in the sagebrush in the winter here. And then in 2023, the winner went to this Baltimore Oriole by Sandra Rothenberg. We were all just stunned by the sort of qualities of this photo, and the colors and the play of the light. But yeah, it turns out that she was carrying horsehair from the neighbor's barn and was building a nest. So it's just incredible how much she was able to fit into her grasp. And we look forward to judging this year 2024 awards. The awards are currently open, so if you have, I'm pretty sure they're open, double check that please. So yeah, if you have any photos of female birds in particular, give it a shot, because it's incredible to go through them, and I learn a lot from what the photographers say was happening and how they figured out it was a female. In conclusion, female birds are not just like the males. They're different biologically in a lot of ways. But both by birders and by scientists, I would say that female birds are underappreciated. And I would challenge you to bird the challenge. It is really hard to look for female birds, but by doing so, by focusing on those subtle traits, I would say that you're gonna become a better birder by looking for differences within a species, not just between species. Some of the questions I'm investigating for my PhD, and unfortunately, it's still a little too early to share out the results, but there's some evidence that male birds live longer than females. So I'm investigating that at a broader, more systematic scale. This is really interesting because in mammals, females live longer than males, such as in humans, but this pattern is flipped in birds. So one of my research questions is to study the survival rates of males and females separately, which, as you might imagine, is a little bit of an understudied topic. I'm also really interested in what other species besides the golden winged warbler that I mentioned. Do male, female, and males live in different habitats? Where does sexual segregation occur? And then it's a really big and open-ended question of how climate change impacts the sexes separately. That certainly deserves more study. I'm not sure if I'll be able to get to it, but it's really important to consider the sexes separately, because they use a lot of different habitats, live in different places, and have different biologies. We should be looking at climate change impacts separately on males and females, since of course both sexes are necessary for species to persist. So yeah, in conclusion, please join us. If you're on social media, use the hashtag #FemaleBirds or hashtag Galbatross Project when you're out spotting a bird. And I just want to encourage folks to look for female birds, talk about female birds with your fellow birders, and to just challenge yourself to notice female birds separately from males in the field. If y'all ever in the West Coast, this is a bush tit. A crazy, I think it's just wild that the female has a yellow eye, whereas male bush tits have a gray iris color. So such a subtle little trait here. Finally, I want to thank you very much for your attention. If you'd like to reach me directly, I'm going to leave my email address up, joannaxwu@ucla.edu, as well as what was formerly known as Twitter, and my website information. And with that, I want to thank you and take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. The grouse picture was my favorite. I love that one. Okay, so we do have our first question. When birding in a group, should we identify sex when we call out species? Most birders don't.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a prescriptive advice for all types of birding, but why not? Especially if you're leading a bird walk, it can be nice to say, oh yeah, there's an eastern towhee, and by the way, this one's female because it's brown and doesn't have a black back of the male. I personally think noting those characteristics will encourage birders to hone in on the skills of being able to tell sexes apart, and I think that's helpful. But of course, if you're like doing a really intensive birding expedition, you might not have time to go into the explanation, and no judgment if we're not always birding for females all the time.
Yeah, just feel free to type your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, everybody, if you have something to ask. What's your favorite part of the research that you get to do?
I really like that I'm exploring a question that not a lot of people have explored, because I think in ecology we tend to, we're like, oh, how many species are in one place? How many birds are on your life list? That's in reference to species. But there's a lot of interesting variation below the species level, such as sex and age. There's so much that's not been studied about the difference between juveniles and adults. I haven't even, that's outside of the scope of my study, but just being able to explore these differences that people don't often think about is really rewarding, because even in scientific conferences, I have a lot of folks come up to my talk and say, "Huh, I hadn't really thought about that." So, um, yeah, I'm glad it can challenge people in some way.
Awesome. We have a few questions coming in. Is it possible that egg laying might contribute to the shorter lifespan of female birds?
Yeah, that's one of the theories of why females live not as long as males. It that theory has found some support among studies across like not large number of birds, but there's other studies that found basically no correlation between the number of eggs you lay and your lifespan. So it's not clear that egg laying contributes, or in general, reproductive costs in general contributes to the shorter lifespan of females. But one theory that's been relatively consistent across birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and such, is that like, so in humans, the female is the XX chromosome, which is homozygous, if you remember from high school biology. But in birds, it's the opposite. So the female has the ZX chromosome. So, and whereas the males have ZZ, and there might be some advantage to having two copies of that chromosome to mask out sort of harmful genetic impacts. So that's one of the theories that might be at play here. Yeah.
That's really interesting. What are the behavioral or migratory changes being noted or anticipated related directly or indirectly to climate change?
Okay. Behavioral or migratory changes. Yeah, so I'll answer the migratory changes first, which is the simplest one is phenology, or when birds are arriving. And I mentioned that we expect them to arrive earlier with climate change, with springs happening earlier. I'm sure that's really felt there. Where you guys are is one of the areas where spring is advancing faster than the rest of US and Canada. So you might have experienced this firsthand. But in terms of behavior, let's see, it's really complicated because, of course, when birds are moving north in the spring, it's unclear whether the resources that they need are also going to advance on the same timelines, such as vegetation melting and caterpillars emerging and such. So I would say that there's a lot of question marks related to that question, and a lot more needs to be studied.
Yeah. Besides field guides, what are some good resources to develop better IDs of female birds? Also, you mentioned how eBird has some gaps on data collection of bird sex. How is Merlin at IDing female species as opposed to males?
Um, I'm assuming, let me know if this is not right, but I'm assuming you mean Merlin, the sound ID, or do you mean a different type of
Yeah,
resource in Merlin?
I think the sound ID. Yeah.
As far as I know, it doesn't tell you anything about the sex. Yeah. Oh, Merlin has sound and visual. Yeah. I'm I don't use Merlin a ton. Yeah, I have never used, I don't use Merlin a ton to like input the characteristics I'm seeing and have them ID the bird. So I'm not really sure, but when I read the descriptions in Merlin, sometimes they'll tell you the males have this plumage and the females have this characteristic. So I think it's species specific. Yeah. But yeah, that's a good question. If you were to input what you see, it should be sex specific, right? Because like if you put in the traits of a warbler, that's a female, you could get a host of different warblers that fit that description, whereas a male might be more specific.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you guys know anyone who works at eBird or want to email them and nudge the Cornell folks to put more sex information into Merlin and eBird, that would be great.
What are some of the most interesting generation to generation cultural findings or insights being studied?
Generation to generation cultural findings. I'm not 100% sure what cultural refers to. Could you elaborate on that? Could the person who asked cultural findings? Yeah, I'm not sure if this means like a human or I'm not sure what it would mean if it's cultural with regards to birds. Maybe we can take a different question and come back.
Come back to that one. Do we see similar kinds of differences between the genders in other orders, such as mammals or reptiles?
Differences between other orders. That's a really good question. I definitely have not dived into habitat differences between like sexes and mammals and reptiles, but certainly there's differences in survival rates between sexes in mammals and reptiles and fish. There's differences in, I think, reproductive biology, endocrinology, physiology are all fields where there's marked differences between sexes. So I would say yes, but I'm certainly not familiar with them all. Yeah.
Okay. Regarding the question before, I think it's referring to just changes in birds' behavior as far as songs and mating and usage of tools from generation to generation. How is that being studied?
Hmm.
How is that evolving?
Hmm. I am not sure. Honestly, this bird behavior and such are well outside of my realm of knowledge, and I haven't been up to date on my reading about that, so I wouldn't be able to generalize. But if we're talking about sex specific, yeah, I'm not sure. Here's something I will that I have read about that's interesting is sometimes in shorebirds like oyster catchers and avocets, males and females have different bill morphology. So like in the American avocet, the males have a longer bill, whereas the female has a shorter, more recurved bill. And they actually exploit different resources. So they forage. The way that they behave, I guess, in foraging behavior is they use different areas. And I think this evolved so that males and females can minimize competing with each other. But I'm not 100% sure if this is what you meant, but that's one example that comes to mind.
Um, let's see, one more question. What are some good resources for young birders and naturalists?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I honestly, despite me sort of giving a couple of what I think are criticisms about eBird, I think eBird and Merlin are fantastic resources, and I would start there. The Merlin app is phenomenal. It works around the world. You can download different packs for where you are and look up what you're likely to see. I used to say field guides, but we don't. Oftentimes, people don't need to carry field guides anymore with Merlin. And in terms of like sex specific resources, the Galbatrosses noticed there was a big gap in that information. And on our website, we are collecting sex specific data. So if you're like, oh, I noticed that this species of woodpecker female, like the acorn woodpecker, females have less red on their head than the male. You can submit that information in the database, and if it's something that we don't already have, we're putting together a spreadsheet of that information, hopefully to make it into a way that can be digestible to the public. But it's still that currently is in the works. Yeah.
Awesome. Does anybody else have any last questions for tonight? All right. Well, if not, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you, Joanna, for being here. This was really interesting, and I hope that everybody tunes into our programs in the future. And we will have this recording on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, if you want to take a look back. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.